The night Harlem learned how thin the line was between courtesy and catastrophe began without shouting. No gunfire. No sirens. It began with a chair scraping softly across a tiled floor and a glass set down with just a little too much force. In a narrow back room above a Lenox Avenue bar, a man forgot himself for a moment and let disrespect slip from his mouth like an accident. The kind of accident that cannot be undone once it happens. Across the table sat Bumpy Johnson, his heavy-lidded eyes fixed, unblinking, absorbing the insult not as a man hears words, but as a ruler measures territory being challenged. No one else in the room spoke. They all felt it. The shift. The moment when something ordinary crossed into something fatal. The man who spoke did not raise his voice. That was the mistake. He believed disrespect required volume to carry danger. He believed calm words were safe words. He believed reputation was exaggerated. Harlem was full of men like him. Men who arrived thinking they understood the neighborhood because they had read about it, heard stories, watched others come and go. They mistook familiarity for permission. He leaned back, smiled thinly, and said a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his shortened life. A sentence that suggested impatience. A sentence that implied equality when none existed. Bumpy Johnson did not react. Not immediately. His face did not harden. His hands did not move. That was what terrified the men who knew him best. Silence was never emptiness with Bumpy. Silence was calculation. It was memory. It was a ledger being balanced in his mind. He let the words settle in the room like smoke. Let the speaker hear himself. Let him believe for one fragile second that nothing had gone wrong. Harlem in those years was not a place governed by impulse. It was governed by order. An order not written down, but understood by everyone who survived long enough to learn it. Power was visible in the way people waited before speaking, in the way chairs were offered without being asked for, in the way doors opened before knocks landed. Bumpy Johnson sat at the center of that invisible architecture. He did not need to shout. He did not need to threaten. His authority was so complete that violence was often unnecessary. But when violence did come, it came with purpose, with instruction, with memory attached to it. Bumpy's rise had not been loud. It had been patient. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, he arrived in Harlem carrying a body shaped by deformity and a mind sharpened by humiliation. The bump on his head that earned him his nickname had been a mark of childhood cruelty, a reminder that the world noticed difference first and kindness last. He learned early that weakness, real or perceived, invited punishment. He also learned that intelligence, when paired with restraint, could bend stronger men. By the time Harlem knew his name, Bumpy had already decided how he wanted power to feel. Not chaotic, not emotional. Power to him was control over time. The ability to delay action until the moment it taught the best lesson. He watched other men rule through fear alone and burn out quickly, leaving trails of corpses and enemies. Bumpy preferred something subtler. He wanted people to fear disappointing him more than they feared dying. That philosophy was why the disrespect in that back room mattered so much. It was not just a personal slight. It was a crack in the structure. If one man could speak carelessly and survive, others would follow. Order would soften. Lines would blur. And Harlem, which survived on clarity, would descend into noise. The man who spoke did not know this history. He saw Bumpy as an aging figure, respected but perhaps slower now. He had been emboldened by small successes, by deals that went his way, by the dangerous illusion that survival meant approval. He thought he was negotiating. He thought he was asserting himself. What he was actually doing was testing gravity by stepping off a ledge. Bumpy finally moved. Just enough to reach for his drink. He took a slow sip, eyes never leaving the speaker. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. He asked a question. A simple one. A question that gave the man a chance to retreat, to reframe, to apologize without being told to. That was Bumpy's method. He believed lessons were strongest when men condemned themselves by refusing escape. The man laughed. Not loudly, just enough to suggest confidence. The wrong answer. From that moment on, the night no longer belonged to chance. It belonged to design. Bumpy stood, and the room followed his movement instinctively, chairs shifting back, bodies creating space. He did not touch the man. He did not threaten him. He simply said the meeting was over. The man was escorted out into the Harlem night, confused but unharmed, still believing he had won something. Still believing the lack of immediate punishment meant forgiveness. That belief would sustain him for exactly 3 days. Harlem continued as it always did. Music spilled from doorways. Numbers runners moved quietly through familiar routes. Police cruisers passed and were passed without incident. Bumpy Johnson was seen in public, greeting people, discussing business, playing chess in the park. Nothing appeared different. That was the most dangerous part. On the 3rd day, the man received an invitation. Not a summons. An invitation. Polite. Specific. A chance to discuss unfinished business. He considered refusing. Pride whispered that he should not be the one to bend. Survival whispered louder. He went. The location was not glamorous. A warehouse repurposed into a social club, the kind of place that did not advertise itself. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. Almost friendly. Food was served. Drinks poured. Conversation flowed. The man relaxed. He told himself he had misread the tension before. That this was how powerful men corrected misunderstandings. Bumpy arrived last. He greeted everyone individually. When he reached the man, he smiled. That smile did not reach his eyes. He sat across from him again, recreating the geometry of their first meeting. Only this time the room was prepared. Bumpy spoke about respect. Not as an abstract idea, but as currency. He explained how respect moved through Harlem like blood, keeping everything alive. He spoke about men who forgot this and how Harlem corrected them. He never raised his voice. He never named the disrespect directly. He let the man connect the dots himself. Then he told a story. A story about another man years earlier who had confused familiarity with equality. A man who thought words were harmless. A man who had to be taught otherwise. As Bumpy spoke, the door behind the man closed quietly. He noticed. His body tensed. Bumpy finished the story by explaining that punishment was not about anger. It was about education. About ensuring the lesson lasted longer than the pain. He leaned forward slightly and asked the man if he understood. The man nodded. Too quickly. Bumpy sighed. He stood. He signaled with a small movement of his hand. The lights dimmed just enough to change the mood. The men who stepped forward were not brutes. They were professionals. They did not rush. They did not shout. They took the man carefully, methodically, as if following instructions rehearsed long ago. What followed was not a public execution. It was not a spectacle. That was not Bumpy's way. It was something worse. Something designed to live with the man long after the bruises faded. Bones were not broken where they could be hidden. They were broken where they would ache forever. Pain was applied with precision. Each blow carried meaning. Each pause allowed comprehension. Bumpy watched without expression. This was not pleasure for him. It was maintenance. He ensured the punishment stopped before death. Death ended lessons. Survival extended them. When it was over, the man was helped to his feet. Bumpy approached him one last time. He spoke softly, close enough that the words belonged only to them. He told him that Harlem did not forgive disrespect. It corrected it. He told him to remember that correction every time he spoke in the future. The man was released into the night, body shattered, mind reshaped. He would live, and he would tell others. That was the point. By morning, Harlem already knew. Not the details. Not the gore. Just the outcome. A man had forgotten himself. Bumpy Johnson had reminded him who he was not. Conversations adjusted accordingly. Voices lowered. Chairs were offered again. The structure held. But beneath that restored order, something darker had settled. The understanding that Bumpy's patience had limits. That his calm was not kindness. That a simple disrespect, when aimed at the wrong man, could become a lifelong sentence. And somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly, already thinking about the next challenge, the next test. The next moment when someone would forget the rules and force him to teach them again. The lesson did not end with broken bones. That was only the visible part, the portion Harlem whispered about in doorways and over coffee cups. The real lesson unfolded quietly, in the days that followed, in the subtle rearranging of behavior that marked true obedience. The man who had been corrected did not leave town. Bumpy Johnson would not have allowed that. Disappearance suggested escape. Survival, visible and altered, was the message that traveled farther. He was seen limping along familiar streets, his posture permanently adjusted, one shoulder lower than the other. He spoke less. When he did speak, he chose his words with care that bordered on fear. People noticed. They always did. Harlem learned lessons by watching what happened to those who forgot where they stood. What few understood was that the punishment had never been about that man alone. Bumpy Johnson had been addressing a much larger audience. The disrespect had arrived at an inconvenient moment during a period when outside forces were testing Harlem's internal balance. The Italian families downtown were restless again, probing borders through intermediaries and low-level deals, trying to sense whether the old order was weakening. Younger men inside Harlem, ambitious and impatient, were beginning to confuse opportunity with entitlement. One careless sentence in a back room was a symptom of that shift. Bumpy treated symptoms early. In private, he reviewed the network that sustained his authority. He understood power as a living system. If one artery clogged, pressure built elsewhere. He summoned lieutenants individually, never together, and asked questions that sounded casual but were anything but. Who had been talking too much? Who had been arriving late? Who had begun negotiating without permission? He listened more than he spoke. Men revealed themselves when allowed to fill silence. The man who had been punished became a reference point. Bumpy never mentioned his name again, but he alluded to him often, describing a situation that was corrected, letting listeners draw their own conclusions. This ambiguity kept fear alive. Specifics allowed men to believe they could avoid the same fate by acting differently. Vagueness reminded them that judgment belonged to Bumpy alone. At the same time, Bumpy began planning something larger. Respect, once restored, needed reinforcement. He decided on a demonstration, not of violence but of control. A public move that would remind everyone who truly governed Harlem's economy. The opportunity arrived through a numbers operation that had grown too successful too quickly. A small group of runners had been skimming profits, redirecting cash before it reached the proper channels. Normally, this would have been handled quietly, with warnings or disappearances. But Bumpy saw a chance to turn correction into theatre. He arranged a meeting with the operations leaders under the guise of expansion. Promises were made. Figures discussed. The men arrived confident, thinking themselves clever enough to profit without consequence. They did not know the meeting location had been chosen for visibility, not privacy. Bumpy arrived with minimal entourage, projecting calm assurance. He congratulated the men on their success, praised their ambition. Then he asked them to account for discrepancies in the books. He laid out numbers with precision that stunned them. Dates. Times. Amounts. The room grew cold. Instead of punishing them, Bumpy offered a choice. Full restitution and continued operation under stricter oversight, or public exposure that would destroy them without a single blow being struck. They chose restitution. Of course they did. Bumpy accepted, then added a final condition. They would spread the word. Quietly. Accurately. Within weeks, the message had circulated. Disrespect no longer meant only physical danger. It meant financial ruin, social isolation, erasure. Violence was merely one language among many, and Bumpy was fluent in all of them. Still, pressure mounted. Law enforcement attention increased, drawn by whispers and rival tips. Federal agents began asking questions again, reviewing old files, re-examining familiar names. Bumpy sensed the shift immediately. He adjusted his routines, changed meeting places, shortened conversations. He delegated more, trusting lieutenants to carry out instructions without needing explanation. The man who had been punished noticed these changes too. He understood now that survival did not guarantee safety. He was alive because Bumpy wanted him alive. That understanding hollowed him out. He became cautious to the point of invisibility, avoiding attention, declining opportunities. He was living proof of what happened when ambition outran awareness. One evening, weeks after the original disrespect, Bumpy summoned him again. The invitation was brief, polite, impossible to refuse. The man arrived early, anxiety tightening his chest. He was shown into a small office, sparsely furnished. Bumpy entered alone. This meeting was different. No audience. No lesson to broadcast. Bumpy spoke frankly. He told the man he had been spared for a reason. That reason, he explained, was usefulness. Experience carried weight, especially painful experience. Bumpy offered him a role that required discretion and loyalty above all else. It was not a promotion. It was a leash. The man accepted immediately. Gratitude and fear blended into obedience. From that day on, he became one of Bumpy's quietest assets, moving messages, observing behavior, reporting deviations. His punishment had transformed him into an instrument of order. Harlem stabilized. The younger men learned restraint. The outsiders hesitated. The system held, reinforced by memory and rumor. Bumpy Johnson watched it all with detached satisfaction. He knew peace was temporary. It always was. Disrespect would return, wearing a different face, speaking in a different voice. It always did. Late one night, alone, Bumpy reflected on the balance he maintained. Power demanded constant vigilance. One lapse invited collapse. He thought of the sentence that had started it all, the careless words that had forced his hand. He did not regret the lesson. Regret was indulgence. He regretted only that such lessons were always necessary. Outside, Harlem breathed, alive and restless, waiting for the next moment when someone would forget the rules and remind Bumpy Johnson why he ruled as he did.